There is a silence that is not just the absence of sound, but a dense, almost palpable presence that envelops everything around and compels those who feel it to look within. Carl Jung knew that this silence was not empty, but a fertile space where the most important battles of the soul take place. Because solitude is not limited to being away from people, it is a state where every social mask falls away, revealing a face often unknown, even to the one who carries it. It is in this territory that the rawest truth about who we are manifests, far from the voices that tell us what we should be. For Jung, solitude was an inevitable necessity for anyone wishing to find the self, the living, creative, and untamed essence that dwells in the depths of every human being. Society trains us from an early age to avoid this experience. We are taught to occupy every second, to fill every void with noise, distraction, companionship. The fear of solitude becomes intertwined with the fear of nothingness, because when the world falls silent, what remains is us, stripped of all the stories we tell others and ourselves. Jung described this as the moment when the persona, that mask shaped to survive in the collective, fragments. And it is in this shattering that many panic, because they realize they may have never truly known themselves. What seemed to be a solid identity begins to reveal itself as mere performance. However, there is something sacred in this process, because it is in this seemingly hostile space that the mind creates the images, symbols, and answers that cannot emerge under the spotlight of everyday life. It is there, in the intimate, that the forces capable of reconstructing us are found. Jung called this the creative void, a state between destruction and possibility, where everything is suspended. Those who have the courage to remain there without fleeing, without numbing themselves, discover that from nothing arise paths that could never have been seen before. But this courage is not simple, as it requires bearing the weight of questions without immediate answers. It requires standing before oneself as before an abyss. Even so, paradoxically, it is in solitude that the deepest connection with all that is human is found. When we disconnect from external noise, we begin to realize that we are not isolated, but immersed in something that transcends us, the collective unconscious, as Jung said. It is in this immersion that we can feel that the pain we carry is not just ours, but also the pain of all, and that our searches echo universal quests. Solitude, therefore, does not distance us from humanity. On the contrary, it returns us to it through a much truer path. It lifts the veil that makes us believe we are alone in our pains and in our dreams. If you are watching this video, perhaps there is within you a restlessness that makes you look at silence not only with fear, but also with curiosity. Perhaps you have already felt that discomfort that arises when everything that was certain begins to lose meaning, when you realize that there is something in you that longs for space, for truth, for freedom. Carl Jung believed that ignoring this voice is to condemn oneself to live an incomplete life. Today, I want you to know that despite all the pain, there is a promise contained in this void. The promise of reconnecting with yourself, not as someone returning to the same place, but as someone discovering themselves for the first time. And it is this journey that I invite you to begin here, with me, because there is no greater solitude than living away from oneself, and there is no greater freedom than finally finding oneself. There comes a moment in life when silence becomes so profound that it seems to tear the surface of reality, exposing something that was once carefully hidden. Carl Jung was one of the few to accurately describe what happens when we find ourselves deprived of the social mirror that sustains our everyday identity. He taught that we all wear a persona, a social mask, that we learn to construct in order to survive and relate to the world. This mask is not just a superficial disguise. It is an intricate structure composed of gestures, opinions, beliefs, ways of speaking, preferences, and even dreams that often did not originate from within us, but were absorbed from others' expectations. We live for years, sometimes decades, believing that this persona is who we truly are. We believe in it so much that we shape our destiny according to its demands. But solitude, relentless and honest, arrives as a force capable of imploding this structure. When the world outside falls silent, we realize that many of the roles we play do not belong to us. The praise we seek, the approval we need, the image we want to project, all of this reveals itself as the mortar that holds up a facade. In the absence of the other's gaze, we see how much of what we call self is, in fact, contaminated by the need for acceptance. And that is where the symbolic death of the persona begins. It is not a quick or painless process. It is like shedding layers of skin, feeling the raw flesh exposed to the cold. It is terrifying to realize that part of our strongest convictions, of what we defend with such fervor, may have been merely an adaptation to the environment, rather than a genuine expression of our soul. Jung described this process as a kind of necessary inner death for something new to be born. Because as long as we are trapped in the persona, there is no space for the self, the most authentic and creative core of our being, to fully manifest. The persona may even protect us, but it also imprisons us, keeping us within narrow limits where nothing truly alive can grow. Solitude forces us to confront the contradictions we hide, the desires we silence, the fears we pretend not to feel. And when there is no one left to witness, the chance arises to look at all of this without masks, without justifications, without the need to appear strong or coherent. It is a brutal confrontation, but it is also the beginning of a freedom that would have previously been unthinkable. However, between the fall of the persona and the emergence of a new self, a strange, disconcerting space opens up, which Jung called the creative void, a territory where nothing seems to be defined, where old certainties have crumbled, but new ones have yet to take shape. It is this space, both frightening and fertile at the same time, that we will explore in the next part. Because it is in this void that both our greatest fear and the seed of our true transformation reside. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Between the death of the persona and the emergence of a new self, a space opens up that is not just silence, but a vast, almost uninhabitable territory where everything seems to have lost meaning. Carl Jung named this territory the creative void, a psychic place where the old forms of identity have been destroyed, but the new ones have not yet been born. It is like floating in a sea without a horizon, with no land in sight, no compass pointing in any direction. This void, despite its name, is not completely devoid of content. It is pregnant with possibilities, full of yet-to-be-revealed potentials, but they present themselves in such an amorphous way that we can only perceive the threat, not the promise. And it is precisely this absence of contours, this feeling of not knowing who one is or where one is going, that makes this space so terrifying. Jung deeply experienced this transition zone during his own periods of isolation when he retreated to Bollingen and immersed himself in his inner visions, intensely recorded in the Red Book. He knew that this void was not just gratuitous suffering, but an essential stage of the individuation process. Because everything that has been deconstructed, the certainties, the roles, the beliefs, needs to make way for something new. But before the new can emerge, we are forced to confront nothingness. And nothingness has a destructive power because it puts into question even the will to continue existing. It is not uncommon for a person entering this void to feel on the brink of madness. It is a territory where language fails, where internal images become more real than the external world, where disconnected thoughts seem to overshadow objective reality. And yet, it is precisely there that the creative power that Jung valued so much resides. In the creative void, all old answers lose validity. The old narratives of life no longer serve to give meaning to existence. It is at this moment that the great existential questions arise, those that have no immediate answer. Who am I without everything that defined me? What lies beyond the roles I have played? What does it mean to live if it is not just to fulfill expectations? Jung did not offer easy answers to these questions. On the contrary, he insisted on the importance of remaining in this state of uncertainty, of enduring the discomfort of not knowing. Because fleeing from the void is to kill the seeds of creation before they can germinate. It is in this barren ground that the self begins to organize new forms, new images, new paths. But this only happens if we have the courage to inhabit the void without trying to hastily fill it with distractions, superficial explanations, or emotional anesthetics. And although it seems cruel, this void is also a fertile field because everything that has not yet existed in us finds space to emerge. Jung saw there an almost magical energy, a force that can both destroy us and transform us. It is at this point that techniques such as active imagination, deliberate silence, and even the formulation of questions without immediate answers become precious tools. Not to flee from the void, but to endure it. To allow something new to come to the surface, something genuinely ours, not imposed from the outside. Because it is only there, in the darkness of this not knowing, that we begin to intuit the existence of a deeper self, a self that is not dictated by circumstances or the gaze of others. But there is still another crucial dimension of this journey that Jung explored masterfully: solitude as a laboratory of authenticity. Because it is not enough to survive the creative void. We must discover who we are when no one is watching us, when there is no audience to applaud or criticize. And it is this territory, where we can finally be strangers even to ourselves, that we will enter in the next part. If there is something that solitude offers us, it is the brutal, and at the same time sacred, opportunity to become strangers to ourselves. For Carl Jung, being alone was not just a pause in social interaction, but a psychic laboratory where experiences that could never emerge under the light of the collective gaze finally found space to flourish. It is in this state that one of the most disconcerting phases of the individuation process begins, the encounter with internal contents that, until then, were hidden beneath the thick layer of the persona. There, in solitude, without the need to play roles, previously censored thoughts begin to sprout, bringing to the surface desires, fears, fantasies, and impulses that seemed incompatible with the carefully constructed image we maintain before the world. Jung knew that the human mind is a stage where dramas, as deep as they are contradictory, are enacted. When we isolate ourselves, we give permission for these plays to present themselves uncut, uncensored, without the immediate intervention of the vigilant superego that judges and labels everything as right or wrong. And this can be terrifying, as we discover that within us reside characters we never imagined we carried. A woman recognized for her delicacy may find herself overtaken by overwhelming anger. A man proud of his rationality may find himself grappling with almost mystical intuitions that challenge all his logic. These contents are not just insignificant psychic residues, they are rich raw material for the construction of a more whole and true personality. It is in solitude that we are called to witness these emerging fragments, not as good or bad, but as legitimate parts of our being. Jung warned that if we do not recognize these facets, they do not disappear. They merely hide in the unconscious, where they begin to influence our choices and behaviors indirectly, sometimes destructively. Therefore, voluntary isolation, far from being an escape, can be a practice of courage, as it implies accepting that we are not linear, simple, or solely coherent beings. It involves looking into our own abysses and enduring the discomfort of seeing in ourselves impulses that we would never dare to admit in public. This authenticity does not emerge as something pure or beautiful, but as something alive, pulsating, imperfect, profoundly human. But there is also a gift in this process, because by recognizing these internal forces, we discover new possibilities of being. The artist who deemed himself uninspired discovers, in isolation, the source of his creativity. The individual who believed himself weak finds, in contact with his shadows, an unexpected strength. It is as if, in solitude, we could experience wearing versions of ourselves that in society would be immediately condemned to exile. There, no one observes us, no one judges us, and we can be ugly, contradictory, poetic, grandiose, or miserable, and above all, true. This internal laboratory is the space where authenticity is forged, not as a perfect ideal, but as the radical acceptance of who we are, with all our lights and shadows. However, this deep experience of authenticity does not happen outside of time. On the contrary, it directly affects our temporal perception, altering the way we feel about the past, present, and future. Because in solitude, the boundaries of time seem to dissolve, opening doors for conversations with who we were and who we can still become. And it is precisely this magical and disconcerting dimension of the solitary experience that we will explore in the next part. In solitude, something happens to time that defies any rational explanation. For Carl Jung, the experience of deep isolation not only reveals ourselves to us, but also tears apart the chronological fabric of reality, blending past, present, and future into a living tapestry where everything coexists. It is as if the clock that marks the hours loses relevance and is replaced by a psychological time, an internal rhythm where the oldest memories can appear with the same clarity as recent events, and glimpses of what has yet to happen emerge as realities as tangible as any memory. This experience is not mere nostalgia or daydreaming. It is an immersion in a field of forces where our personal biography connects with something much greater: the history of humanity, archetypal images, the pains and hopes of all those who came before us. Jung lived this intensely, especially during the years he dedicated to his inner journey, recorded in the Red Book. In his writings, he recounts how, in states of deep solitude, images and characters from centuries past would appear in his mind with impressive clarity, as if they were alive beside him. He perceived these visions not as hallucinations but as legitimate manifestations of the collective unconscious, that layer of the psyche that transcends the individual and belongs to all humanity. In those hours, solitude ceases to be merely a private space and becomes a bridge to much broader realities, where we are both witnesses and protagonists of dramas that seem to echo through generations. It is in this expanded time that we can understand that our pains and fears are not just ours, but part of something greater that has been unfolding for millennia. This altered temporal dimension opens extraordinary possibilities for self-knowledge. When we are deeply alone, we can revisit episodes from childhood not just as memories, but almost as present experiences, feeling again the emotions, the smells, the atmosphere of those moments. And likewise, we can project our consciousness forward, intuiting possible paths, lives we could live, choices we can still make. Jung called this ability personal archaeology, digging through the layers of memory to discover patterns that repeat, unresolved stories that continue to influence the present. It is not uncommon for perceptions about issues we thought we had overcome to arise in this process, yet still exert a secret power over our daily decisions. Furthermore, in solitude, there is the practice of circular time, a sense that certain themes, fears, or questions return to our lives at different phases, as if they spiral closer to the center. Jung saw this as an essential movement for individuation, as revisiting the same subjects from new perspectives is what allows for a deeper understanding of who we are. It is also in solitude that it becomes possible to establish internal dialogues with past or future versions of ourselves, creating what Jung called temporal conversation. We can talk to the teenager we once were, listen to their hurts or interrupted dreams, and we can also converse with the elder we will become, seeking advice, wisdom, or courage. These experiences are not merely exercises of imagination. They are powerful ways to integrate dispersed parts of the psyche, building a more solid and coherent self. However, this entire journey through time would not be complete if we did not understand that, despite disconnecting from the world, it is precisely in solitude that we often feel the greatest connection to humanity. Because when everything falls silent, we discover that we are not as alone as we thought. And it is this profound paradox, the discovery of universality through disconnection, that we will explore in the next part. It is a fascinating mystery that, precisely when we distance ourselves from the world, we can feel almost painfully how much we belong to it. For Carl Jung, this is one of the greatest paradoxes of human experience. It is in deep isolation, when we cut off external voices and dive into our own abysses, that we become capable of perceiving the invisible strings that connect us to everything and everyone. It is in solitude that universal truths emerge, those that do not belong solely to our personal history, but that resonate with the frequency of the collective unconscious. This immense reservoir of images, symbols, and experiences that Jung identified as the common psychic heritage of humanity. Even when alone, we discover that our anguish echoes the anguish of millions of human beings throughout the centuries, and that our yearnings, our pains, our doubts, are individual variations of ancient melodies that all of humanity has sung. During his retreats in Bollingen, Jung experienced this connection in an almost mystical way. The absolute silence, the long hours of contemplation by the lake, all of this transported him to a dimension where he could feel in a concrete way that his individuality was immersed in an infinite sea of shared human experiences. He understood that there are thoughts that are not just ours, but that flow through us like underground currents coming from remote eras. This is why, in the most intense solitude, we can be struck by images or emotions that seem to have no direct relation to our daily lives. Archetypal images that emerge from the depths of the psyche, bringing messages that speak as much of us as of everyone. Jung wrote that, often, solitude reveals itself as a space where we unknowingly converse with universal figures, the wise one, the hero, the old king, the great mother, the trickster. These are symbols that connect us to the rest of humanity, and that, at the same time, help us to better understand who we are. However, this perception of unity does not impose itself gently. On the contrary, it often comes laden with pain as it confronts us with the fact that our personal battles are not exclusive. What we thought was merely our problem, anxiety, melancholy, fear of failure, the feeling of emptiness, is in fact part of something much larger. There is a loneliness that wounds because it separates us, but there is another that heals because it shows us that we are not alone in our human condition. True solitude shatters the illusion that we are isolated, disconnected entities and allows us to perceive that we are chapters of a much broader collective story. Every tear we shed mixes with the tears of countless generations that came before us, and every hope we ignite contributes to illuminating the path for others as well. This realization can crush us under the weight of responsibility, but it can also liberate us, as it shows us that, even in the darkest moments, we are part of something greater than ourselves. It is also in this state of deep connection that the most transformative insights about the human condition arise. When we disconnect from the external noise, we can hear the oldest voices of humanity whispering in our thoughts. It is as if, by silencing the world, we open space to be inhabited by ideas that never belonged to us, but that, paradoxically, seem to speak directly to our hearts. Jung believed that the greatest leaps in individual consciousness occurred in this place, where solitude became a bridge to the universal. And for this reason, those who experience this form of solitude never return to being the same, as they begin to carry with them not only their own story, but also the living memory of the entire human species. However, if solitude is capable of connecting us so deeply to the collective, it also places us face to face with something even more definitive, the certainty that we are mortal. Because when everything that is transient and superficial falls silent, we come face to face with our own finitude. And it is this dark and inescapable dimension of solitude, the direct confrontation with death and the meaning of life, that we will explore in the next part. There are moments in life when silence becomes so absolute that nothing else seems to exist beyond the sound of one's own blood running through the veins. For Carl Jung, it was precisely in these moments that the human being was forced to confront the most uncomfortable truth of all, that we are finite. Solitude not only tears us away from the distractions of everyday life, but compels us to contemplate the fragility of our existence, to recognize, without masks or subterfuge, that we are beings destined to disappear one day. There is no noise capable of protecting us from this encounter. And when everything falls silent, what remains is the question that many try to avoid their entire lives. What am I doing with the little time I have? Jung understood death not as a simple biological event, but as a psychological factor of gigantic proportions. He knew that living without integrating the reality of death into consciousness is to live a superficial life built on fragile illusions. In solitude, the presence of death is felt almost physically. There are people who, when isolating themselves, feel an inexplicable cold coursing through their bodies, or are invaded by an anguish that seems greater than any fear they have ever felt. It is the sudden awareness that every passing second is irretrievable, that everything we love is doomed to impermanence. The walls of the house seem to echo this truth. Objects take on the air of silent witnesses to the time that slips away from us. And in this brutal perception, the risk of falling into deep nihilism arises, believing that nothing makes sense, that living is merely a succession of empty days waiting for the end. But Jung saw, in this very terror, the possibility of redemption. For him, recognizing one's own mortality was not succumbing to despair, but finding the ultimate motivation to live authentically. The certainty of death is the force that pushes us to define what truly matters, to abandon the facades and seek experiences that make us feel truly alive. That is why, in isolation, impulses arise to review one's own life, to ask oneself if one is living according to deep values or merely going with the flow of conventions. Jung called this existential inventory, and it is in this inventory that many discover they have spent years in battles that were not theirs, or in relationships that never touched their hearts. Death, as a psychic presence, demands clarity, courage, and above all, commitment to what makes life worthwhile. There are practices that Jung recommended to face this dark dimension of solitude. He spoke of meditating on impermanence, a conscious exercise of contemplating everything that is transient, people, things, projects, even our own emotions. Not to cultivate sadness, but to learn to value the present moment. He also suggested the last day method, to imagine with all possible intensity how we would live if we knew today would be our end. There is no mask that can withstand this type of reflection. What remains after this raw and naked vision is an almost luminous clarity about who the people, dreams, and choices that truly matter are, and this can completely change the course of a life. At the same time, solitude also connects us to something that transcends our individual existence. There are those who, in the deepest silence, feel an inexplicable peace arise, as if, even while recognizing their own finitude, there were a mysterious continuity in which we are embedded. Jung saw this happen repeatedly. Individuals who, after traversing the dark night of the soul, emerged with the feeling of belonging to something greater, something that survives death and gives meaning to the brief passage we have here. It does not matter if we call this soul, self, spirit, or collective unconscious. The fact is that solitude, while confronting us with death, also offers us a glimpse of eternity. It is as if, by accepting our mortality, we discover that there is something in us that can never be destroyed. And it is precisely from this indestructible spark that the creative self is born, this mysterious force that invites us to recreate ourselves infinitely. But along with this freedom of creation comes the terrifying responsibility of choosing who we wish to be. And it is about this radical freedom, with all the risks and wonders it brings, that Jung warns us. Because in the end, solitude does not only offer us the chance to know ourselves, but places us before the harshest of truths. We are free, and therefore responsible, for everything we become. If you have made it this far, it means that within you lies the courage to look into these depths. I want to know, which part of this video moved you the most? Share in the comments, because even in our solitary journeys, there is strength when we share our discoveries. And don't forget to watch the next video. It is also important. I'll see you there.